Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light, settling on the canvas of Ring 3. Conrad Hayes threw his head back and laughed, a booming sound that rattled the gym's cheap tin roof. He thought the skinny kid in tailored slacks was a complete joke. He absolutely was not. Akira chewed the frayed end of a wooden matchstick, letting the sharp alkaline taste of sulfur bleed across his tongue. He leaned against the peeling plaster wall of the Oakland gym, arms folded over a gut that had surrendered to cheap beer and gravity a decade ago. It was a Tuesday. The air hung thick and claustrophobic, smelling heavily of wintergreen liniment, stale sweat, and damp cotton. In the center of the matted floor stood Conrad Hayes. Conrad was a monument to traditional discipline. 220 pounds of Iowa farm boy, chiseled down and hardened by years of rigid Shotokan karate. When he moved, it wasn't with grace, it was with a mechanical, terrifying efficiency. He was currently abusing a heavy bag patched with yellow duct tape, sinking deep into a horse stance. Every punch he threw ended with a sharp guttural exhalation that echoed off the cinder block walls. Snap, hiss, thud. The heavy bag didn't swing. It shuddered, absorbing the blunt trauma of a man who believed that physics was a simple equation. Mass times acceleration equaled destruction. Akira respected Conrad, even if he didn't particularly like him. Conrad had the kind of arrogance that came with never having his jaw wired shut. He was undefeated in point tournaments, a darling of the martial arts circuit, a man who treated smaller fighters with a patronizing pat on the shoulder. The heavy metal doors at the front of the gym shrieked open, dragging across the concrete floor. The sudden wedge of sunlight cut through the dim room, revealing a silhouette that didn't belong in a fighting gym. Bruce walked in. He looked more like a jazz musician or a sociology student than a fighter. He wore charcoal slacks that broke perfectly over polished leather loafers, a crisp white button-down shirt, and thick, dark-rimmed glasses that magnified a restless, calculating gaze. He didn't strut. He darted. His movements were small, nervous, and utterly devoid of the heavy, grounded permanence that Conrad radiated. Akira shifted his weight, his bad knee clicking in protest. He watched Bruce approach the matted area, talking a mile a minute to a nervous-looking promoter named Jimmy who trailed behind him carrying a clipboard. Bruce was gesturing wildly, his hands carving arcs in the air, speaking about formlessness and water. Conrad stopped hitting the bag. He unwrapped the tape from his knuckles, dropping the damp strips onto the mat like discarded snakeskin. He looked at Bruce, and his upper lip curled. "This him?" Conrad asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through Bruce's frantic monologue. Bruce stopped. He turned slowly, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose with his index finger. "I am Bruce. You must be Conrad." "I am," Conrad said, crossing arms the size of cured hams over his chest. "Jimmy said you wanted to spar. Said you had a new system, some Chinese boxing thing." "Not exactly." Bruce smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His jaw muscles feathered. Akira noticed it immediately. The kid was smiling, but his nervous system was humming at a dangerous frequency. "It's not a system. Systems trap you. They make you predictable, like a robot." Conrad's eyes narrowed. "I don't feel trapped, Bruce. I feel pretty solid." "Solid as a corpse, my friend. Fluid as alive." Bruce stepped onto the edge of the mat, not bothering to take off his loafers. It was a slight, an amateur move that made Akira wince inwardly. You didn't walk onto a man's mat in street shoes. It was disrespectful, or incredibly arrogant. "When you hit that bag," Bruce continued, pointing a lean finger at the swaying leather, "you commit your whole structure. You plant your feet. You lock your hips. What happens if the target moves?" "I don't miss," Conrad said flatly. "Everyone misses." Bruce chuckled, a dry, reedy sound. "And when you miss with all that committed weight, you're falling. You're a tree tipping over. I prefer to be the wind." Conrad stared at him for a long, silent moment. The gym had gone entirely quiet. The few other fighters in the room had stopped their jump ropes and shadow boxing. All you could hear was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant wail of a police siren on San Pablo Avenue. Then, Conrad threw his head back and laughed. It was a booming, genuine laugh that echoed in the rafters. It wasn't menacing. It was worse. It was pitying. He looked at Bruce, a man who gave up at least 50 pounds and a foot in reach, and saw a street corner magician. "The wind?" Conrad wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "Okay, kid. Look, I don't want to hurt you. You weigh what? $140 soaking wet? We spar, I'm going to break something, and Jimmy's going to lose his deposit for the demonstration next week. How about you show me a kata? We can talk philosophy after." Akira spat his matchstick into a nearby trash can. He felt a twinge of second-hand embarrassment for the Chinese kid. The world of fighting was cruel, governed entirely by the brutal realities of leverage, bone density, and mass. Bruce was trying to argue with gravity, but Bruce didn't look embarrassed. He looked faintly annoyed, like a mechanic listening to a customer describe an engine problem incorrectly. "I don't do katas," Bruce said, his voice dropping an octave, the frantic energy suddenly evaporating into a cold, clinical stillness. "They are dry land swimming. But I can show you how a smaller mass generates terminal force, if you're open to it." Conrad stopped laughing. His pride, pricked by the calm authority in Bruce's tone, flared up. "Show me. Let's see the wind." Bruce walked to a stack of equipment near the heavy bags and picked up a focus shield. It was a thick, dense rectangle of padded leather, designed to absorb full-power kicks. He tossed it to Conrad. It hit the big man's chest with a heavy slap. "Hold that," Bruce instructed, walking back to the center of the mat. "Hold it tight against your chest, both hands on the straps. Brace yourself." Conrad looked at the pad, then at Bruce, thoroughly amused. He slid his thick forearms through the leather straps and hugged the shield to his sternum. He widened his stance, sinking his weight into his heels, locking his knees in a textbook defensive posture. He looked like a bank vault. "You want me to stand here?" Conrad asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "You going to get a running start?" "No," Bruce said. He walked up to Conrad, stopping so close that Akira could see the contrast in their breathing. Conrad was breathing deep, slow, taking up space. Bruce was barely breathing at all. Bruce raised his right hand. He didn't close it into a fist immediately. He left his fingers loose, relaxed, hovering exactly 1 inch from the center of the leather shield. His elbow was bent, hanging casually by his ribs. His stance wasn't a deep, rigid crouch. His feet were staggered slightly, his knees soft. He looked completely unanchored. "Right there?" Conrad mocked. "You're going to push me?" Akira crossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. He had seen parlor tricks before, board breaking, ice smashing. It was all about driving through the target, but from an inch away, there was no runway, no space to generate momentum. It contradicted every law of mechanics Akira had spent 30 years teaching in boxing rings. "I'm not going to push you," Bruce said softly. He didn't scream. He didn't draw a dramatic breath. What Akira saw next happened so fast his brain had to reconstruct it from the afterimage. Bruce didn't lunge. He sank. It was a microscopic drop in elevation, a sudden violent grounding of his hips. In that fraction of a second, a kinetic wave traveled from the ball of his rear foot, up his calf, whipping through his waist and snapping up into his shoulder. The loose fingers curled into a fist at the exact microsecond of impact. The bottom 3 knuckles aligned perfectly with the radius bone of his forearm. It wasn't a push, it was an explosion, crack. It didn't sound like a punch. It sounded like a heavy work boot stepping on a dry, hollow branch. An ugly, sharp, inorganic noise that made the hair on the back of Akira's neck stand at attention. Conrad didn't fly backward across the room like a stuntman on a wire. Reality is rarely that cinematic. Instead, the big man's eyes bulged, the whites expanding in pure, unfiltered panic. The dense leather pad buckled violently inward, compressing directly into his rib cage. Conrad's feet actually left the floor by half an inch as his entire body spasmed, but his forward momentum died instantly. He took one clumsy, staggering step backward, his boots squeaking harshly against the mat. Then, he dropped the pad. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. He crumpled forward, his massive frame folding in on itself like a collapsed building. He hit his knees with a heavy thud, one hand bracing against the mat, the other clutching his right side. His face, seconds ago flushed with arrogance and vitality, turned a sickening shade of gray. A horrible, wet wheezing sound filled the silent gym. Conrad was trying to inhale, but his lungs were misfiring, starved of oxygen by the shock to his diaphragm. A thick line of saliva dropped from his slack jaw onto the mat. He dry heaved, his broad back shuddering violently. Akira's matchstick fell from his lips. It hit the floor, completely unnoticed. A cold sweat broke out along his collar. He had seen men knocked out. He had seen bones broken. But he had never seen a 220-pound athlete dismantled with a twitch. The sheer, violent transfer of energy defied reason. Bruce did not look triumphant. He didn't stand over the fallen champion and pose. In fact, his reaction was deeply, almost awkwardly, imperfect. Bruce immediately pulled his hand back, frowning at his own knuckles. He rubbed his wrist, muttering under his breath in rapid Cantonese. He looked irritated, like a concert pianist who had just hit a slightly flat note during a private rehearsal. Jimmy, the promoter, broke the spell. "Christ, Conrad!" he yelled, sprinting across the mat, his clipboard clattering to the floor. "Hey, somebody call an ambulance! Get ice!" Bruce snapped out of his internal critique. He looked down at Conrad, who was now fully curled into the fetal position, his breath coming in high, panicked squeaks. The reality of the damage seemed to finally register with Bruce. He stepped forward, his loafers squeaking on the mat, and crouched awkwardly beside the massive, gasping man. He reached out a hand, hesitating, not quite knowing where to touch him without causing more pain. Don't try to breathe deep," Bruce said, his voice stripped of all its earlier philosophical polish. He sounded genuinely flustered, an ordinary guy who realized he had just broken something expensive in a store. "Short breaths, shallow. The lower ribs are probably cracked. The cartilage, you know, it transfers." He looked up at Akira, who was staring at him in stunned silence. Bruce offered a tight, apologetic grimace, adjusting his thick glasses again. "I think my elbow was a little stiff," Bruce said to Akira, completely oblivious to the absurdity of the complaint. "The energy pooled in the joint. It should have been cleaner." Akira stared at the skinny kid in the slacks, then down at the mountain of muscle writhing on the floor, and finally understood. It wasn't a magic trick. It was a terrifying, weaponized understanding of the human body. Bruce wasn't a fighter in the way Akira understood the word. He was an engineer of violence, and Conrad Hayes, the immovable object, had just met a fluid, devastating force. Paramedics arrived 19 minutes later, though to the men stranded on the Oakland gym floor, it felt like an agonizing geological epic. In that endless window of time, the atmosphere in the gym completely soured. The sharp, nostalgic scent of wintergreen liniment was swallowed by the sour, metallic odor of cold sweat and pure, primate fear. Conrad had stopped dry heaving, but his breathing remained shallow and ragged, a terrible, wet clicking noise accompanying every inhalation. He lay perfectly still on his left side, his massive right arm wrapped defensively around his torso, guarding the wreckage. Akira knelt a few feet away, holding a damp gray towel he had snatched from a locker room bench. He didn't offer it. There was no point. You couldn't wipe away a collapsed structural framework. He just watched the heavy rise and fall of the champion's chest, his own bad knee throbbing a dull, sympathetic rhythm. Bruce, meanwhile, was entirely incapable of stillness. He paced the perimeter of the matted square. His leather loafers squeaked sharply against the vinyl. Scuff, squeak, scuff. A manic metronome tracking his frustration. He wasn't looking at Conrad with pity or guilt. He was looking at his own right hand, flexing the fingers, curling them into a tight fist and releasing them again. His brow was deeply furrowed beneath the thick frames of his glasses. I telegraphed," Bruce muttered to no one, stopping abruptly. He snapped his hip forward, throwing a phantom strike at the empty air. Too much shoulder. The kinetic chain stalled at the triceps. That is why it pushed him back. It shouldn't have pushed him back. It should have dropped him exactly where he stood. Akira stared at him, bewildered. Kid, you caved his ribs in from an inch away. I think the chain worked just fine. Bruce snapped his head around, his dark eyes flashing with genuine irritation. Working fine is not the goal. Perfection of the mechanism is the goal. If I hit a brick wall with that exact same flaw, the energy rebounds. I shatter my own wrist. He survived because my form was sloppy. Akira swallowed hard, the dry click audible in his own throat. He survived because my form was sloppy. The kid wasn't bragging. That was the terrifying part. He was issuing a clinical self-assessment. He viewed Conrad not as a conquered rival, but as a faulty crash test dummy that had unfortunately highlighted a flaw in the engineering. The heavy gym doors finally banged open, admitting a pair of EMTs hauling a canvas gurney. They rushed the mat, their heavy black boots tracking Oakland street dirt onto the sacred vinyl. "What do we got?" the lead medic asked, dropping to one knee beside Conrad. He unclipped a pair of heavy trauma shears from his belt. "Sparring accident?" Jimmy, the promoter, stammered, his face the color of old oatmeal. He was hovering near the heavy bags, clutching his clipboard to his chest like a shield. He caught a bad shot to the ribs. The medic grabbed the lapel of Conrad's heavy canvas gi and began cutting. The thick cotton resisted the blades, snapping loudly with each bite of the shears. As the fabric fell away, Akira winced. The skin stretching over Conrad's right floating ribs was already blooming into a sickening mural of trauma. It was deep violet at the center, radiating out into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The rib cage itself looked architecturally wrong, a distinct, concave depression hovering awkwardly where convex bone should have been. "Jesus," the second medic muttered, gently probing the discolored flesh. Conrad let out a muffled, agonizing shriek, his eyes squeezing shut. Felt a grind, multiple fractures, probably some cartilage tearing. "We need to get him stabilized and oxygenated. Hook him up." Bruce stepped forward, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The energy transfer was highly localized," he offered, leaning over the medic's shoulder. "The primary impact was on the floating ribs, but the shock wave likely traveled upward into the intercostal muscles. You should monitor his diaphragm for spasms." The lead medic looked up, glaring at Bruce's tailored slacks and crisp white shirt. "Step back, buddy. We got this. Who the hell hit him with a baseball bat anyway?" "I hit him," Bruce said simply. "With my fist." The medic looked from the slight, 140-pound frame of the Chinese man to the 220-pound ruined giant on the mat. He snorted, a harsh sound of disbelief. "Right, sure you did. Just back up and give us room." Bruce looked like he wanted to argue the physics of the strike again, to draw a diagram of leverage and torque on a chalkboard, but Akira reached out and grabbed his elbow. "Let them work, kid," Akira said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Bruce looked at Akira's hand on his arm, then nodded once, stepping back. The frantic energy seemed to suddenly drain out of him, leaving behind a profound, weary isolation. He watched as they strapped the undefeated Shotokan champion onto a backboard, securing his massive frame with heavy nylon belts. Conrad didn't look at Bruce as they lifted him. He stared fixedly at the water stains on the ceiling panels, his jaw locked in a rigid grimace of pain and utter humiliation. The reality of his own fragility had been violently introduced to him, shattering a lifetime of concrete certainty. The gurney rattled violently as they rolled it off the mats and across the concrete floor. The metal doors opened, swallowing the EMTs and the broken champion, then slammed shut. Jimmy chased after them, frantically yelling about liability waivers and insurance premiums. Then, the gym was quiet. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, a persistent, annoying hum that seemed incredibly loud now that the room was empty. The air felt heavy, stale, and entirely devoid of the violent electricity that had crackled through it 20 minutes earlier. Akira limped over to a rusty vending machine, humming aggressively in the corner of the gym. He dug into the pocket of his faded denim jacket, fishing out 2 quarters. He fed them into the slot. The machine accepted them with a heavy mechanical clunk. He hit the button for Coca-Cola. A heavy glass bottle rattled down the chute. He fed the machine again and bought a second one. He walked back to the edge of the mat. Bruce was sitting on the apron, his legs dangling over the edge, staring at the exact spot where Conrad had collapsed. He looked small now. Just a guy in a wrinkled button-down shirt. Akira popped the metal caps off the bottles using a rusted opener bolted to the wall, then walked over and extended one to Bruce. Bruce blinked, pulling himself out of his heavy thoughts. He looked at the sweating glass bottle, then up at Akira. He took it, nodding in silent thanks. Akira eased himself down, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet room. He sat next to Bruce, resting his elbows on his knees, holding the cold glass against his cheek for a moment. "You trying to get that guy killed?" Akira asked softly. It wasn't an accusation, it was a genuine inquiry. Bruce took a slow sip of his soda. "I warned him. I told him he was a statue. Statues crumble when the earth moves. He was the middleweight champion of the coast, kid. He wasn't a statue. He was a brick wall. Bricks are dead." Bruce sighed, a long, weary exhalation. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs, turning the glass bottle slowly in his hands. The condensation dripped onto the toes of his loafers. "Look at this place." He gestured vaguely to the heavy bags, the makiwara boards, the rigid wooden dummies. "Everyone here is practicing to be a corpse. They learn a routine. Block, punch, step, 1, 2, 3. They think fighting is a rehearsed dance, but violence is chaos, Akira. It doesn't care about your tradition, it doesn't respect your belts." Akira took a long pull of his soda, feeling the harsh bite of the carbonation burn the back of his throat. He thought about his own boxing days, the endless drills, the jab-cross-hook combinations practiced 10,000 times until they were permanently etched into his nervous system. Drills build muscle memory, Akira argued gently, though his heart wasn't entirely in it anymore, not after what he had just witnessed. "They build habits," Bruce corrected, his voice dropping, losing the abrasive edge it had carried earlier. Now he just sounded tired. "And a habit is a predictable pattern. The moment you are predictable, you belong to me. If I know you will block high, I already own your ribs." Conrad anchored himself. He offered me his center of gravity on a silver platter because his tradition told him a wide stance is strong. Bruce shook his head, looking down at his blistered knuckles. "Water," Bruce said, almost to himself. "You have to be water. If you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you pour it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow or it can crash." Akira had heard philosophical garbage from martial artists before. Men who talked about chi and invisible energy fields right up until they got punched in the mouth and forgot how to stand up. But when Bruce said it, it didn't sound like mysticism. It sounded like applied thermodynamics. Water didn't need a wide stance to drown you. It just occupied the space you couldn't defend. "They're going to hate you for this, you know," Akira said quietly. Bruce looked at him. "Who?" Everybody," Akira replied, gesturing to the empty gym. "The promoters, the traditional masters, the guys running the dojos making a killing selling colored belts to suburban kids. You didn't just break Conrad's ribs today. You broke the whole illusion. You proved that 50 years of tradition can be dismantled in half a second by a guy in street shoes who understands leverage better than they do." A heavy, poignant silence settled between them. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to shift pitch. Akira looked at his own weathered, knobby hands. Decades of wrapping tape, lacing gloves, holding pads for heavyweights who hit like freight trains. He had always believed in mass. He had always believed that the bigger, tougher, more grounded man would inevitably win. Today, he watched a ghost dismantle a mountain. He felt old, profoundly, deeply old. The game he had dedicated his life to was changing, evolving into something terrifyingly efficient, and it was leaving him behind. Bruce finished his soda and set the empty bottle on the floor. It clinked sharply against the concrete. "I don't want them to hate me," Bruce said, his voice remarkably soft, exposing a sudden raw vulnerability that Akira hadn't expected. He pushed his glasses up, looking at the heavy bags. "I just want them to wake up. I want them to see the truth of the human body, but people prefer a comfortable lie to a painful truth." Painful is an understatement, kid. Conrad's going to be pissing blood for a week. Bruce offered a small, crooked, entirely imperfect smile. He will heal. But his karate? His karate died today. And that is a mercy. Akira chuckled, a dry, cynical sound that scraped the back of his throat. He pushed himself up off the floor, his knee screaming in protest. He reached down and offered a hand to Bruce. Bruce looked at the calloused, weathered hand, then reached up and gripped it. Akira hauled him to his feet. Despite the skinny frame, Bruce felt dense, anchored to the earth by an invisible, terrifying gravity of his own making. "Come on," Akira grunted, grabbing his empty bottle. "Let's get out of here before Jimmy realizes he's going to have to mop the mats himself." They walked out of the gym together, pushing through the heavy metal doors and stepping out into the blinding, unforgiving glare of the Oakland afternoon. The air outside smelled of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. The traffic on San Pablo Avenue roared past, loud, chaotic, and entirely unpredictable. Bruce stopped for a moment, adjusting his collar, letting the chaotic noise of the city wash over him. He breathed it in, looking perfectly at home in the disorder. Then, he turned and walked down the street, his loafers clicking lightly against the pavement. Akira watched him go. He pulled a fresh wooden matchstick from his jacket pocket and stuck it between his teeth. He knew he was looking at the future. It wasn't wearing a GI. It wasn't bowing to a shrine. It was just a guy walking down the street, moving like the wind, ready to crash into whatever dared to stand still. If you felt the raw impact of this story, don't let it stop here. We explore the gritty human side of legends, the doubts, the flaws, and the moments that shatter history. Hit the like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who appreciates the real philosophy of martial arts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a knockout story. Stay fluid and stay tuned for the next one.